Hi, everyone. This is Jay Newman with a double GDP sprint update for partnerships for the sprint ending here on May 27th, 2020. Really interesting sprint for partnerships in the last couple of weeks. I'm going to talk to you about several things. First, we're going to talk a little bit about some kind of like new framing updates on the landscape of new cities and charter cities. And in terms of their orientations and their development plans that Nolan and I learned from a discussion with our partner, our close partner, Mark Lutter of the Charter Cities Institute. Second, I want to talk a little bit about some pattern matching that we're beginning to see across the community that we're working with in Zambia and other new city founders that we've been talking to. As we basically kind of like look for product market fit, right? We look for a broader set of needs that new city founders have that are actually in common across the different environments. And then third, I want to show just a little bit of some mock-ups that we've been doing as part of our partnerships work. As we've talked about this, we've talked to another kind of like community builder in the new and charter city space in terms of what they are seeing this broader community need potentially from a software perspective and how software tools might help enable that community to kind of move forward. So on the first side, Nolan and I had a great kind of like update meeting, as we try to do about every month or so with our closest partners. And so in this particular case, this was with Mark Lutter and the Charter Cities Institute, and where we really kind of got an opportunity to see how how the institute is really moving things forward, what it's focused on, and some of the critical learnings that they're having. Doing really awesome stuff there in terms of thought leadership around the new and charter cities and kind of like special economic zones and stuff like that. They're working on a book and a handful of other kind of like pieces of writing that can kind of be some of the core reusable assets that the founders of new cities can kind of like look to basically say, these are best practices for for legal documents. These are best practices for the structure of a business registry. These are the best practices for the layout of a legal system, et cetera. So that group team is really moving things forward fast there. It's also just great to see that they've hired a number of new people in the last month or so. They're just getting good momentum, I think. But maybe the most important learning that came up in our conversation, we were sort of talking to Mark about some pattern matching that we were trying to see across the different new city founders that we had been talking to, and what Mark articulated, I think, is a really important framework for categorizing these new city projects. And what he basically said was, he's like, look, there are kind of two new city projects that you can kind of cluster, two new types of city projects that you can cluster a lot of these efforts into. One is basically typified as this idea of real estate, and the other one is maybe kind of typified by the idea of like a special economic zone. And so the characteristics of kind of the one that is much more about real estate at its kind of like in instantiation at its earliest stages, when these things all come together, they are often described as master planned communities, right? Like they have places to work and places to play and homes to move into and all that kind of stuff. And the plan itself is an articulation of how all the different real estate pieces fit together. And what's really interesting is that as we sort of talk to Mark, that category, the kind of like the real estate oriented projects, their earliest customers, the mindset that those customers have is one of invest, not move, right? Or invest before move. And especially in a lot of developing countries like Africa, folks are kind of like actually like putting money into these real estate projects because there really aren't alternative investment vehicles. And so this is a great way for them to save, whether or not they're kind of like planning to move to those communities in the very near term. They may in the future, but in terms of the very near term, what they're actually looking for is an investment vehicle. And so you can kind of think of it as being about a master planned community, an invest and save mindset of the earliest customers, and people who are really oriented to vision and kind of the potential of the future. And so that's the first category of these projects, that we're seeing. And that was good and clarifying in the conversation with Mark. The second category, and there are a number of projects that look like this. We kind of gave the headline of a special. They're most characterized by like a special economic zone, and Mark likes to call these kind of a city come city, or city qua city, or something like that. But effectively, what people are moving to for these for these cities, right, is actually better jobs today. And so the special economic zones that are sometimes as small as like an industrial park, and sometimes much bigger, right, like your Shanghais and your Shenzhens and stuff like that. The key value proposition that they are really oriented to is the work that can be gained right now, right? And Mark even talked about how, like, across history and across countries, the population who moves to the SEZs, the industrial parks, et cetera, actually looks demographically quite different than what we're seeing with the people who are kind of like really attracted to some of these big master planned communities, right? The population for the special economic zones in the industrial parks are much more characterized by young, male, people who can move fast to the jobs, and are really kind of seeking that need out immediately. The characteristics of the master plan communities: a much more diversified set of age groups in the earliest set of customers, the people who are kind of like buying into the vision of that master plan community. A much more diverse set of genders across a lot of these different countries, and again, like what they're moving into those places and they're signing up for is different, right? Like they're signing up for the SEZs are really signing up for like better jobs today. For the master plan communities, are really signing up for better, like greater potential for tomorrow, which I think is really interesting. The second little piece of pattern matching that occurred across our partnerships work over the last sprint here happened as we had a follow-up meeting with the founder of a new town, small town in the United States that kind of had met originally last year and got to catch up with in this past week. And our conversation between Nolan, me, and him really came to, what are you learning about, like, basically getting your town off the ground and getting the first pioneering residents in, and how does that compare to the experiences that we're seeing in some of the countries in Africa that we're partnering with, that we're moving into. And what's really interesting is that many of the there's some real threads of commonality across those things. For instance, Nolan has really come to be talking about like kind of like the two key types of needs that we've been seeing with a lot of the services that the cities we're working with need, right? Is that like that people are buying in terms of the earliest pioneering residents. They're buying in based on vision, right? Real clear big picture vision, and they're getting on board. But they're moving in after they buy in. They move in based on much more mundane sets of activities, like to tell the story of kind of like acquiring bricks in order to be able to build your home. But it's a lot more kind of like of the everyday regular showing of progress that ends up being really important. And for Nolan, he's really began thinking of this as kind of like a paradigm that just doesn't exist in most of people's like relationships with the cities that they move to, right? That managing those mundane activities, those everyday activities of taking the steps to moving in, for an everyday person at least, is something that actually, like, there's not a good paradigm for a good, well-managed, responsive public service in your relationship with your city, in your relationship with even like the developer of an apartment building or an HOA or something like that. Typically, those are very strained interactions, and actually the responsiveness is typically just non-existent. that's kind of like really showing us a key opportunity there, and something that we had been honing into. Um, and this gentleman who's the founder of the new city in the United States that we've been talking to, or the new town in the United States we've been talking to, he said very much the same thing. You know, he's like in their organization, they've been starting to talk about like kind of like two stages of customer development: the pre-deposit stage and the post-deposit stage. And the things that they need to do pre-deposit, you know, before people have kind of like put down money and said, yes, I really want to be like one of the first residents of this new area, are totally different marketing and sales tactics and tool than the ones that they really need to be managing in terms of post-deposit, right? Which is a whole different set of things. And so we really thought that was just fascinating. And we also see a lot of commonalities in terms of who those pioneering residents of these two towns are, right? Like at Nkwashi, where we're working in Zambia, the earliest residents are ones, honestly, who are just ready to sign up and move in even before some of their houses are completed. Like the very first woman who's kind of like building on the construction site there, you know, her plan was basically to, you know, build a portion of the house, move in, and finish it as it goes. And we heard a similar thing in this new town. We said like, hey, who are going to be your very first people actually living in the community? And what he said was, he's like, you know, honestly, like we kind of anticipate it could be someone who just like actually like drives an RV up and parks it next to their plot while they're still building their home. And you know, that's a surprise, right? That like the first people who are going to move, you know, might not even wait for their home to be finished. They just want to be there so much. And of course, as a management company, like how do you manage that is a really important question. But I think the one that is really attractive to Nolan and us and our team here at DoubleGDP is, what does that tell you about your first 1,000 customers, and how are those people just completely different than your next 10,000, because they really are. Even the first 100 are completely different than the first 1,000. The types of marketing and sales techniques you need to be deploying, and therefore the tools that we might be enabling you with, they look a little bit different. So this is that kind of like second major like key piece of learning that came out of our partnerships effort, and this spread. Just really fascinating by, and we'll continue to kind of like talk about through our company and all that kind of stuff. The third one has to do with you know, a potential future partner who we've gotten to know, someone else who is sort of a community builder and consultant in the space of new types of cities, charter cities, special economic zones, that type of thing. And we had a great conversation with him about like how their organization works, what types of projects they consult on, all that kind of stuff. And a thing that they're kind of like basically building right now is they're sort of like trying to build a database of all of the different new city projects and special economic zones that are out there, just to kind of like how basically help the community know about what different types of projects exist. And so as a way to kind of like help DoubleGDP sort of like process like what I felt like we were hearing from him, as well as, you know, just to sort of like mock up some of the ways that we might be able to help this these types of community builders move forward. I've been working with our design team here to basically mock up what are some of the ways that technology might help that hub become real, right? And if you think about it, right, basically like a hub like this basically needs a handful of things, right? It needs a map view of all of the different new city projects that exist. So that you can basically zoom out and see these various different types of cities. And you can zoom in and actually like see some details, for instance, about like the new city type. Does it have a particular type of economic charter? Are there like key rules, like all that kind of stuff? And probably like sort by scale. So basically the overlap of a database and a map, where the database is like holding very important information sort of at the community level about like what are these different types of new city projects, how do they compare. And the goal of that map view, right? The goal is basically to show that this movement towards new cities is growing, right? And where the growth is actually occurring. So you visualize the growth to make it feel real. You know, the second thing that you probably want to do is actually like have a tile view of the exact same thing, so that you can sort of compare and contrast the different projects. And what this really does is it gives the new city founders an opportunity to sort of like highlight their project, special things about them, right? Like a profile view of that new city, so you could see, how big is it? How many hectares is it? Like, what's the anticipated population going to be? What are going to be some of the economic rules there, right? Like, are there particular tax rates that might be different in this city versus another city? Why might you move there? What are some of the key promotional materials that you might sort of like host on, and hope that either the businesses, individuals, or actually what we're really learning is the investors in these new types of city projects, the types of things they might want to know about your project. So they can compare and contrast and sort of like pay attention to what is going to be the right like new types of community for them. And then we keep hearing more and more that across this like basically community of people who want to build new types of cities and new types of economic zones and stuff like that. The way they tell their story to the various different folks who have capital, right, like who might back those projects, is complicated because there aren't actually a lot of like compare and contrast tools to show the various different investor groups that they work with, right? Like the private equity companies and the venture capital fund companies and the family offices and all that kind of stuff, who are interested generally in these types of investments, international development community as well. An opportunity to really kind of like radar in, almost like Morningstar or some of your like really typical financial tools, to compare like potential investments that you might make in a new community. And so we think in investor tools and portfolio tools actually like might be a really big unlock for this community of folks who are interested in new city projects. Same thing for for the businesses who are interested in moving there, much in the same way where an investor might actually compare and contrast moving to one city in Africa versus another. This is also a consideration that your largest businesses in the world are going through. If you're Google and you're Microsoft and you want to domicile 500 engineers or customer support representatives in one city in Nigeria versus another, how do you make the comparison between those two and sort of like keep track of that decision over time? So there's probably a collection of business tools for evaluating and considering where you're going to go. And then finally, there's a bunch of tools for the people who are actually like managing any of those individual communities. And then we think this is basically a collection of a lot of the tools that DoubleGDP has been building right now. This is about CRM and sales tools and content marketing tools that a new city builder or administrative team might need to be using. That's at its simplest level, it's contact management and content marketing tools that actually, like, if you tune them correctly for a city project or instead of a B2B business sales organization, we actually think there's a real opportunity to kind of like hone in on the exact right things and make the process of holding on to those relationships with both the businesses and residents who are going to move into your city and who are really interested in it, just easier to manage. So that's a collection of the things we've been working on here for partnerships on DoubleGDP for this last sprint. A little bit longer of an update today, just because I wanted to make sure like we're still putting ideas into the community's head here on like on how this opportunity around technology for new cities is evolving. And that's it for this sprint. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.